The elevator doors slid open on the 80th floor, and Betty Lou Oliver barely had time to register the hallway in front of her before the building exploded. The blast hit like a giant fist. The floor jumped. Glass shattered. Betty Lou was thrown backward out of her elevator car and into the lobby wall as smoke, debris, and burning fuel ripped through the upper floors of the Empire State Building. One moment, she had been working a normal Saturday shift as a 20-year-old elevator operator. The next, the tallest building in the world had been torn open by a B-25 bomber lost in thick Manhattan fog. The aircraft struck between the 79th and 80th floors on the morning of July 28, 1945. Lieutenant Colonel William F. Smith, Jr. had been trying to fly from Bedford Army Airfield to Newark, but visibility was terrible, and after descending over Manhattan, he never cleared the skyscraper. The bomber smashed into the north side of the building at high speed. The impact hurled wreckage through offices, sprayed aviation fuel across multiple floors, and ignited a fire that raced through rooms full of desks, files, and people who had come to work expecting an ordinary day. Inside the tower, everything turned to confusion. Smoke rolled into corridors. Office workers stumbled toward stairwells. Some people were burned where they stood. Others were trapped behind debris or walls of fire. Betty Lou lay injured near the elevator bank, badly shaken and in pain. She had been operating her car just below the point of impact, and the force of the crash had flung her clear. She was alive, but she had burns and internal injuries, and rescuers knew she needed to get downstairs fast. Men moving through the wrecked floor made a quick decision. The stairs were jammed with panicked workers and filling with smoke. Getting a badly injured woman down dozens of flights by hand would take too long, so they lifted Betty Lou into another elevator car and sent her toward the ground. For a few seconds, it seemed like the right choice. The doors closed. The car began to descend. Betty Lou, hurt and disoriented, leaned against the interior wall as the elevator passed below the damaged floors. Then the cables failed. One of the bomber's engines and part of the landing gear had plunged into an elevator shaft during the crash. The impact damaged the shaft system and severed the lines supporting the car Betty Lou was riding in. There was no warning, no slow jerk, no chance to brace. The elevator dropped. It fell through the shaft in a sudden violent plunge that turned the world into speed, noise, and darkness. Betty Lou had already survived the plane crash. Now she was trapped in a metal box, falling roughly 75 stories toward the basement of the Empire State Building. The car roared downward through the shaft while air screamed around it. The walls shook. The cables above had snapped away. Gravity had complete control. There was nothing a person could do in that moment. No lever to pull, no door to open, no way out. Betty Lou was alone inside a falling elevator, injured, terrified, and dropping through one of the tallest buildings on Earth. Then the car hit bottom. The crash mangled the elevator and buried it in twisted metal and dust. Under normal conditions, a fall like that should have killed anyone inside instantly. But the conditions inside the shaft were not normal. As the elevator plunged, the snapped cables fell beneath it in a tangled heap. Those heavy coils helped absorb some of the impact. At the same time, the falling car compressed the air below it, creating a cushioning effect that reduced the final force. It was still a catastrophic crash. It just was not quite as catastrophic as pure free fall onto bare concrete. Rescuers reached the basement expecting a recovery operation. Instead, they found Betty Lou Oliver alive. She had suffered severe injuries, including a broken pelvis and damage to her back and neck, but she was breathing. In a disaster that had already killed the 3 men on the aircraft and 11 people inside the building, the sight of a living woman inside that crushed elevator car seemed almost impossible. Yet there she was, pulled out of the wreckage after surviving one of the longest elevator falls ever documented. The people who found her had every reason to expect a body. Elevator shafts were supposed to be death traps in accidents like this, deep concrete channels built to contain machinery, not spare human lives. But when rescuers cut through the crushed metal, they heard movement. Dust coated everything. The air in the basement was thick with the smell of oil, smoke, and hot steel. Betty Lou was trapped in the wrecked car, hurt so badly she could barely move, yet still conscious enough to respond. It was an image that stayed with the men who pulled her out. A young woman who had already been blown out of one elevator by an airplane strike, now somehow alive after a plunge that should have ended her instantly. Above her, the rest of the building was still burning. Firefighters fought flames on the upper floors while smoke poured from the open wound in the side of the tower. The force of the impact had sent part of the plane through the building and scattered debris onto nearby streets and rooftops. One engine flew out the far side and crashed onto a neighboring structure. Another section dropped into the shaft system. Office floors around the impact zone were blackened and torn apart. People below looked up from the streets of Manhattan at flames licking from the side of the world's most famous skyscraper. The crash itself lasted seconds, but the damage reached far beyond the point of impact. Workers on the affected floors were burned, trapped, or thrown by the blast. Families would spend the rest of that day waiting for news from hospitals, police lines, and newspaper bulletins. New York had lived through blackouts, war rationing, and casualty lists from overseas. But this was different. A military bomber had struck the middle of Manhattan in broad daylight, and the city had to make sense of it while the war was still going on. For Betty Lou, the disaster became something even stranger. She had not just survived the crash of the bomber into the building, she had survived a second, separate catastrophe inside the same event. Hurt in the blast, placed in an elevator for rescue, then dropped nearly 1,000 feet and found alive at the bottom. It sounded less like a newspaper report than a rumor people would refuse to believe if the building itself were not standing there as proof. Doctors treated her injuries, and she lived. The Empire State Building was damaged but structurally sound, and parts of it reopened within days. The fire was brought under control in less than an hour. Investigators later pieced together how the fog, the pilot's route, the impact, and the damaged shafts had combined into one of the most bizarre accidents in New York history. But the part people remembered most was the elevator. They remembered the young operator who had already been thrown from one car by a bomber strike, only to be loaded into another and sent downward through a building full of smoke and fire. They remembered the snapped cables, the 75-story plunge, and the rescuers who reached the basement expecting the worst. And they remembered that when the mangled doors were finally opened, Betty Lou Oliver was still alive. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.